Last week, we saw three of the four articles of the upcoming Cambridge Quarterly Healthcare Ethics issue focused on sentience. Since then, five more articles are out on their first few section, and at least two of them are about antinatalism. David Benatar's Sentience and Why It Matters talks about various kinds of interests that beings can have, which kinds of interests should be morally considerable, and what are the implications of those moral considerations. The paper argues that the key idea is sentience and everything else builds from there. In simple terms, sentience is the ability to feel or experience something like pain, pleasure, or perception. But perceiving and feeling are not exactly the same. Perception is about sensing the external world, like seeing or hearing, while feeling can happen even without any external input. But both share one core feature: consciousness. By consciousness, I mean a state of subjectivity, something that it feels like to be. If there is something it feels like to be that being, then it is conscious and therefore sentient. This is what separates conscious beings from things like rocks, machines, or even plants who don't have their inner experience, at least based on our current understanding. Out of these entities and objects like rocks, machines, plants, animals, humans, maybe artificial intelligent beings in the future, which entities should matter when we are talking about morality? In other words, which of these entities have moral standing? So far, it looks like an easy question to answer. To be morally considerable, one must be capable of being harmed or benefited. To be capable of being harmed or benefited, one must have interests. Only sentient beings can have interests, and therefore, the conclusion: only sentient beings are morally considerable. Case closed. Happy to go home. But Benatar points out that the assumption that only sentient beings can have interests is false. This table shows five kinds of interests. On the lowest row is the functional interest, which are interests of any functioning system which may not even be a living being. For example, you could say that it is in the interest of the telephone for it to be kept dry. Above that row are the biotic interests, which are the interests that merely living beings can have. Like, for example, plants who are not conscious but they do have interest in continuing to live or being watered and so on. Compare this to the mere functional interests on the row below, which are interests imposed upon the system by some external source. So, in case of telephone, the interest is imposed by the owner of that phone, whereas in case of plants, the interest to be watered is generated internally within a particular plant. In the middle row are conscious interests, which are the functional interests held by a conscious being. Note that the being itself may not be conscious of having those interests. It's just that the being has those interests and the being is conscious or sentient in the sense that it feels to be that being. On the second row are sapient interests. These are interests of beings who can think, who have some degree of cognitive capability. So we have moved from merely feeling beings who had conscious interests to thinking beings and their interests. Note that the thinking here is not an unconscious computational capability. It is capability to think consciously by a conscious being. Otherwise, even a computer has computational ability, but it is not a conscious being, at least as of today. Finally, on the topmost row are the self-conscious interests, which are the interests of beings who are aware of themselves and of their interests. These are at the top of the table because the interests have a hierarchy. They are incremental from bottom up. Excluding the bottommost row of functional interests, which are of those mere objects, other four interests are incremental in the sense each kind of interest is incorporated in the succeeding interest. So, for example, a self-conscious being will have sapient interests, a sapient being will have conscious interests, and a conscious being will also have biotic interests. This incremental hierarchy is not necessary, but it is just the fact of the world that we live in, because tomorrow we might have artificial sentient intelligence which is not biotic and therefore may not have biotic interests and yet may have sapient interests. Another way these interests could be said to be in an incremental fashion is through the evolutionary path. So, if you look at biological evolution that has happened, biotic interests evolved first, then came conscious interests, and then came sapient interests, and then self-conscious interests. And so the boundaries between these interests are not always clear and sharp. We will find organisms which are overlapping between two categories and sitting on the boundary. So with this classification of interests, Benatar asks which interests should be considered while deciding moral standing of a being. If we have to draw a line, as it is drawn in this table, between conscious interests and biotic interests, meaning it is sentient beings who have a moral standing, then we have to prove that one, sentience is a necessary condition for a being to be morally considerable, and sentience is a sufficient condition for a being to be morally considerable. Not everybody agrees on this. For example, there are environmentalists who think that biotic interests and even the interests of ecosystems are sufficient for moral standing. So they think that sentience is not a necessary condition for a being to be morally considerable. On the other hand, there are so many people who think that mere sentient beings who may have conscious interests but may not have self conscious or sapient interests need not be considered in our moral decisions. Benatar does not say this, but one example I can think of is those people who think of other animals as not morally considerable, and it is okay to eat them or exploit them because they may not have self conscious interests. For those people, mere sentience is not a sufficient condition for the being to have a moral standing. So, how does one resolve this on this scale of interests? Where do we draw the line to decide which beings are morally considerable? Benatar does not provide a hard and fast proof of where we should draw the line, but an intuitive recommendation. If functional interests of a machine are not respected, then there is no subject who is being benefited or harmed. Same is the case with biotic interests of merely living beings who are alive, but there is no subject to care about what is good or bad for them. But that cannot be said about conscious interests, where there is a conscious subject who can be said to be benefited or harmed by promotion or by impeding their interests. For those who think that sentience is still not necessary for moral standing, Benatar challenges them to prove otherwise. So, for example, if they argue that wanton destruction of a plow or a plant is wrong because it harms the plow or plant, then they need to make a convincing case that this is indeed wrong and not because of its impacts on sentient or sapient or self conscious interests. On the other hand, those people who think that sentience is not sufficient enough for moral standing, they need to answer the question about our duties to humans who are sentient but may not be as sapient or self conscious. Benatar does not say this in exactly those words, but I think the case that he is referring to is of those humans who are mentally less abled, or children or babies who are not yet able to think like adults and are unaware of their own interests. So, if we accept that sentience is both a necessary and a sufficient condition for moral standing of a being, then the next question is what kind of interests of those beings should be morally considered? At the minimum, conscious beings have interests in avoiding unpleasant mental states such as pain and having positive mental states such as pleasure. But as we saw, since interests are incremental, conscious beings also have biotic and functional interests. They have an interest in avoiding hunger and thirst, for example, and also in doing their functions. If these interests are hindered, these beings can be harmed. Those who have sapient interests would have an interest in cognitive stimulation. Self conscious beings would also have higher interests like religious freedom, interests in justice, and so on. One important interest that sentient beings have is the interest in remaining sentient and continuing consciousness. But this does not mean that there is an interest in starting sentience or consciousness, and that is why Benatar ties all of this to the antinatalist conclusion. Claiming that sentience is significant should not be understood to imply that becoming sentient is good. While sentience brings moral standing, the fundamental reason for this is that in becoming sentient, a being becomes vulnerable in ways that make that being in need of moral protection. That is a bad deal. It is better never to have become a sentient being. The second paper is by Amanda Suknik, The End of Sentience. This is her first solo authored academic paper, so congratulations to Amanda for this. Now, the end of sentience in an issue which is focused on sentience may sound contradictory, but it makes sense given that we've just looked at David Benatar's view, who is saying that becoming a sentient being is a bad deal. The paper begins by arguing that antinatalism is not a single unified idea. It's more like a spectrum of positions that all agree on one thing: procreation is problematic, but disagree on how far that idea should go. Some versions focus only on humans, others extend this concern to all sentient life. On one side, you have anthropocentric antinatalism, which says that humans should stop reproducing, but leave the rest of life alone. On the other side, sentiocentric antinatalism says that if suffering is the problem, then all sentient life becomes morally relevant. And once you take that second step, a difficult question appears. If suffering matters everywhere, should humans actively intervene to stop it everywhere? Sentiocentric forms recommend the eventual extinction of all sentient life. While humans could voluntarily choose to cease reproducing, sentiocentric antinatalism implies, sometimes explicitly requires, active human intervention to end the reproduction of other sentient beings, potentially involving coercion or violence. The question of whether we should leave animals alone is a dividing factor. Animal rights, veganism, and antinatalism have a lot of things overlapping, and the paper notes that, with some exception, nearly all, David Benatar included, of the most prominent antinatalist philosophers are vegan. But that doesn't mean that everybody agrees on the question of animals. Anthropocentric antinatalists, meaning human centric antinatalists, won't have much time to care about whether other animals are reproducing or not. But even those like Patricia McCormack and Les Unite of Voluntary Human Extinction Movement agree that we should not be harming animals, but when it comes to extinction, they only consider humans. Even within sentiocentric antinatalists, who consider all sentient beings as coming under antinatalism, there are those who believe that only the animals that humans breed should be considered and that breeding should be stopped, while others also try to include all sentient beings, including wild animals, under antinatalism. And then there is this further question of what do you do once you consider wild animals under antinatalism? Do you sterilize them or do you kill them? What do you do? Sterilizing them has its own problems, like we are playing God with them, some might say, and the whole project can go wrong, resulting in worse situation than what we started with. Ecosystems are a complex web of interconnected and interdependent species, so it is very hard to get an optimal solution. And even after all the considerations, some killing may be required. That is why Mati Hairi constructed a thought experiment of a guinea pig called Marzipan. This was a three-part video series published on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast channel in July last year. The idea was quite simple. You are the last human left and you are dying soon. You have a pet guinea pig called Marzipan and he is healthy right now. You can leave food and water for him for the period after you die, and Marzipan will continue to live a happy life. But eventually, he will go through gradual suffering before succumbing to death himself. So the question is, should you rather euthanize him now before you die out so that he is saved from the future suffering? This thought experiment was constructed to examine the question, can the ending of a life be antinatalism? Does coming to such conclusions require additional beliefs, or does it follow that sometimes ending lives can be part and parcel of antinatalism itself? And the answer to that could depend on which definition of antinatalism one is using. If you think antinatalism is a normative position about what one should or should not do, that is, you should not reproduce and so on, then ending an existing life may not come under antinatalism. But Amanda says that if you consider Benatar's secondary definition, which is more of a descriptive form, antinatalism is the view that coming into existence has negative value, then it becomes difficult to see why the pro-mortalist choice to terminate Marzipan's life should be considered anything other than an antinatalist one, or how such an act of killing extinction could be clearly distinguished from antinatalism itself. I don't quite understand this framing, but it may be helpful to think in terms of interests that Marzipan has. This is not something which Amanda says in the paper, but still, recall the hierarchy of interests that we saw in David Benatar's article. Surely, a guinea pig is sentient at minimum and so has conscious interests. Further, we have to evaluate what kind of interests Marzipan has and which of those are morally relevant. For example, Marzipan has an interest in continuing to exist. Marzipan also has an interest in being saved from suffering. In this thought experiment, these two interests seem to be in conflict with each other. Now, if you consider death as bad, that is the state of being dead, as bad. And of the reasons why it is bad is that that being's interest to continue was thwarted, then it may have an equal moral weight against its interest to be protected from potential suffering. And that is what seems to be Benatar's view. I am not considering the suffering in the process of dying here for two reasons. One, we are euthanizing marzipan, and two, we are assuming that unlike humans, guinea pigs don't have a sense of future or even future death. They live in the moment. If you see the state of being dead as neither bad nor good, like Epicureans do, then the only interest to consider is that of protection from potential suffering. So it might be morally permissible to euthanize marzipan. I don't intend to fully flesh out all our duties here, but I just want to show different views from this thought experiment referred to in this paper. We started with a descriptive part of antinatalism and came to the implication of killing marzipan. So it is still an implication of antinatalism and not part of antinatalism. On a stronger account, if you think that inaction in the face of injustice is morally wrong, then it may be even wrong to not euthanize marzipan. Amanda also concludes on similar lines. The ostensibly safer course of non intervention may itself constitute humanity's greatest ethical failure. Yet, active prevention risks its own indelible harms. A new dissertation was archived on Phil Papers, which is based directly on antinatalism, the concept of human suffering in David Benatar's philosophy, a study within the framework of pessimistic philosophy and antinatalism by Ahmed Ali at Almamoon University in Baghdad, Iraq. It talks about pessimist thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer, Emil Chiron, before explaining David Benatar's arguments in detail, which come from his Better Never to Have Been. Ignore the typos in it, but it is a compact reading for anyone who is new to this subject. And if you're already familiar with antinatalism, then one point to note is how far academics have come with antinatalism. Karim Akirma's work about antinatalism was rejected for being too radical in 1997 in one of the German universities. Merely 30 years on, antinatalism is discussed in universities around the world. That is fast progress. One bad news to end this video: since the start of the US-Iran war, many things have become costlier. One of them is condoms. This is the headline that the Trump admin wants more babies and the Iran war is making condoms more expensive. The CEO of the world's biggest condom manufacturer says they'll need to increase prices up to 30%. What a neat coincidence for Trump admin's creepy pro-natalist agenda. Carex is the biggest manufacturer of condoms and is supplied to big global brands like Durex and Trojan. Its CEO has said that because of supply chain disruption caused by the war, the price of condoms will have to be transferred to the consumer. Raw materials like rubber and nitrite needed in making condoms are getting costlier. This is on top of Trump administration's cuts to USAID last year. In October, the administration let approximately $10 million worth of contraceptives go to waste, including about 26 million condoms. And now, with this illegal war, things are getting worse once again. As usual, it is the developing countries which will be affected the most. Developing countries will get screwed over the most. We are seeing a lot of more condoms actually sitting on vessels that have not arrived at their destination but are highly required. So, you see how unfair this world really is? Why bring someone here?